A Song of Ice and Fire's Westeros is most likely the most diverse continent in fictional literature, made up of various noble houses and royally united under the banner of House Baratheon. Westeros was fairly peaceful at the beginning of the series. There hadn't been a war in quite some time. But as you all know, the fall of Bran Stark would change all of that and cause a series of events that became the story that we know and, well, love today. But what if Bran's fall wasn't what caused chaos to erupt in Westeros? What if instead the proverbial wrench being thrown into the gears was the arrival of one Napoleon Bonaparte, the famed and oft-criticized Emperor of the French, King of Italy, mediator of the Swiss Confederation, protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, and the co-prince of Andorra, the man who basically put an end to the brutal French Revolution in November of 1799, the man who conquered various territories around France and turned his country into one of the most feared empires in human history. Many have considered Robb Stark to be like a young Napoleon, with his gift of strategy making him a near unstoppable force on the battlefield. But then I started wondering, what would happen if the actual Napoleon was involved in things? What if Napoleon was, for some reason, transported to the continent of Westeros while Robert Baratheon is still king? What would be the consequences? What if Napoleon Bonaparte invaded Westeros? So first, we need to establish some ground rules here. Will Napoleon be transported to Westeros all by himself, or with his entire loyal army? Well, I'm kinda going with his army, because if he were by himself, then he wouldn't really be able to make much of an impact on the world. Sure, he was really great at motivating people and forming alliances, but Napoleon is an outsider in Westeros, and would be treated as such by the noble houses. Therefore, any hope of a rebellion against the nobility would likely end in a harsh suppression. Therefore, we're going to go with the entire army coming with him. The first thing that he would be likely to do, however, would not actually be war, but studying. You see, throughout his life, he was an avid reader and firmly studied various topics such as science, philosophy, and history, which is what he would do here. He would study the histories of the noble houses and the geography of the land in order to plan an offensive. However, one thing does need to be addressed here, and that's that Napoleon couldn't speak very good English. He could speak some English, but he wasn't particularly good at the language, and he kind of gave up on it. However, considering that English is the primary language in Westeros, or as it's referred to in Westeros as the common tongue, we're just going to assume that Napoleon definitely would get a translator, and at some point soon would probably decide to master English completely, since the country he's about to conquer is going to be an English-speaking country, so he's going to need to learn English. So that's that problem out of the way, for those of you who are wondering. Now, with his knowledge acquired, I believe that the first place Napoleon would try to invade would actually be the Reach. The Reach has the most fertile land in the entirety of Westeros, and Napoleon has a lot of mouths to feed. Assuming he's arriving at the height of his power, his army consists of about 1,000,000 soldiers. So since the Reach has the most fertile land, and therefore the most natural vegetation, I can't really see him going anywhere else. Napoleon also really enjoyed living off of the land, and there's no better place to do that than in the Reach. Of course, House Tyrell would laugh at the vague threats that Napoleon would send, but Napoleon would prove himself to be no laughing matter. You see, not only were Napoleon's men notoriously loyal to their emperor, but they also have muskets and cannons. All that the Westerosi really have to combat them at a distance are siege towers and archers, and neither of them are always accurate, and they aren't too useful unless they're up close. Napoleon's muskets would be able to shoot the enemy from about 50 yards away, completely catching everybody off guard. So he would sweep through the entire Reach easily with minimal casualties on his side. Highgarden is easily conquered, Though not unscathed, the Tyrells are either exterminated or forced to surrender by Napoleon. So then next, Napoleon would turn his attention to reach his neighbor of Dorne, the one kingdom that even the mighty Targaryens failed to conquer on two different occasions, and the kingdom that really hates the Baratheons, the Lannisters, and the Tyrells. Napoleon wouldn't want to conquer Dorne, however, but instead form an alliance with them. Having dealt with the Tyrells already, their most long-term adversaries, and promising to do the same to the Baratheons and Lannisters, the Martells would of course decide to ally with Napoleon. The Martells gravitate towards people with power and respect, and Napoleon has those in spades. The only thing I can imagine really getting in the way of this is the Martells' loyalty to the Targaryens, and that house is weaker than ever at the moment. So the fearful Tyrells and now the Martells are added to the Napoleon's scarily large army, and they march to Storm's End, intent on keeping their promise to the Martells to take out the Baratheons. The Baratheons would probably be Napoleon's biggest challenge yet. Well, at least Storm's End itself is. You see, this large and modernized army would, per usual, sweep through the majority of the land and eventually make their way to Storm's End under the command of Renly Baratheon, who might not even be there, honestly, since he's the master of laws in King's Landing at this point. Regardless, Napoleon still conquers Storm's End, and whether it be Sir Courtenay Penrose or Renly himself, they refuse to surrender and are executed for their troubles. Napoleon would then put on one of the Martells in charge, and the Stormlands become a puppet state, solidifying their alliance. Then next up is the big one, King's Landing itself. Robert Baratheon is a worthy adversary, but he's no longer in his prime by this point, and with no other options would be forced to seal the gates. But this doesn't stop Napoleon's cannons from breaching the walls. The Starks, meanwhile, have been traveling to the south to aid the Baratheons, but they're forced to turn around when their planned alliance with the Greyjoys falls through, and Balon Greyjoy crowns himself King of the Iron Islands. You see, this happened to Robb Stark during the War of Five Kings, and don't tell me that it wouldn't happen with Ned Stark, the guy who actually beat him during the Greyjoy Rebellion and took his son. I guarantee you that this same thing would have happened. So, Ned Stark really has no other choice but to return to the north to try and save his family, leaving King's Landing on its own to be inevitably defeated by Napoleon. The Lannister army would then arrive under the command of Tywin, but it's just too late by now, and King's Landing has been conquered by the French. King Robert is dead, as are his quote-unquote children, and his wife Cersei. Jaime is also killed here. Tyrion is not killed. I'll explain what happens to Tyrion a bit later. But needless to say, Tywin is furious, and he vows to put an end to Napoleon. But even the mighty Tywin can't do anything about Napoleon's military superiority, and is forced to surrender. I can just hear all of you guys telling me in the comments section how unlikely it would be that Tywin would actually surrender, but he really just wouldn't have any other choice. He would see what happened to all the other enemies, and Tywin's not dumb enough to try and pick a fight with an enemy he knows he can't defeat. So he is forced to sue for peace. Now, Napoleon sees a lot of trouble coming from killing Tywin, and after conversing with the Martells, they all agree that it's okay to send him to the Wall, where his experience would be put to good use. And the same thing happens with Tyrion, who Napoleon actually admires and would like to keep around as an ally, but since the Martells are a bit more useful as allies, he decides to send both Tywin and Tyrion to the Wall. He spares them execution. With the fall of Tywin Lannister, Robert Baratheon, and the entire royal family, King's Landing and the Westerlands are officially annexed by the French. So now Napoleon has actually conquered most of Westeros already. However, he still has some kingdoms to go. He decides to leave the North and the Iron Islands to their own war, and he sets his sights on the Riverlands, in particular Riverrun, which has never actually been conquered before. Napoleon faces not so fierce opposition actually, because Hoster Tully is sick in bed, and Brynden the Blackfish Tully is actually in the Vale at this point in the story. However, Napoleon's forces are getting a bit depleted since the Martells actually decide not to follow Napoleon north, because they've already gained everything that they wanted. They already control the Stormlands, they defeated all the houses that they don't like, And honestly, there's not a lot of reason for the Martells to follow him up north unless Napoleon forced their hand. So Napoleon is forced to form a new alliance with the Freys, assuming that his wife and his son Napoleon II came with him. He would likely offer to marry his son or one of his many brothers to one of the Frey girls, and promises to make them the new lords of Riverrun in exchange for their loyalty. They agree, of course, and mount a successful invasion of the Riverlands, adding to Napoleon's great empire. The Freys become the lords of the Riverlands, and the promised marriage occurs before Napoleon makes his next stop in the Vale. So, needless to say, if Napoleon isn't making the people of Westeros absolutely shit their pants by this point, then conquering the Vale definitely will. Nobody has ever mounted a successful invasion of the Eyrie before, besides the Targaryens on their dragons, of course, but nobody's ever mounted a successful ground invasion of the Vale before. And Napoleon realizes that they need to be dealt with before the Starks. Conquering the Vale will crush anybody's morale because it's thought to be impenetrable. So he travels to the Vale, where he's of course blocked by the Gates of the Moon and a vengeful Blackfish, but Napoleon's cannons make short work of the gates. But next is the Herculean task of climbing the Mountains of the Moon. It's very, very perilous trying to climb these mountains. There's a reason that Maya Stone is a guide. These mountains really do need a guide. But since Napoleon was capable of crossing the Alps, I don't think the Mountains of the Moon would be impossible for him to cross on his own, although he might have to leave his cannons behind. Despite losing his cannons though, the Eyrie itself just isn't really all that heavily defended since nobody's ever made it that far before, and so Napoleon easily conquers it, forcing an easy surrender out of Lysa Arryn and her son Sweet Robin. Napoleon then forms a lasting alliance with the Arryns by giving Lysa Littlefinger to marry. Littlefinger, in my opinion, would be smart enough to ally with Napoleon early on, and would thus be available for Lysa to marry. And then there were two kingdoms left. The first of them is the North. Exhausted by war against the Greyjoys, the North have little left for Napoleon. The only trouble the North really provides Napoleon is at Moat Cailin, but not for long. In the end, Ned Stark, fearing for his family's safety, is forced to surrender to Napoleon and is allowed to remain Warden of the North. Although I could imagine the Boltons defying the Starks and attacking the French, but they would be put down pretty easily. And then finally we have the Iron Islands, which despite being devastated by a war that cost the life of King Balon Greyjoy, would actually be Napoleon's biggest threat, surprisingly. You see, Victarion is actually elected during the King's Moot, since Euron Greyjoy has no dragons to control with his horn, so he doesn't inspire the people to vote him in as king, because Daenerys' dragons are still babies at this point, so that's not much of a threat to say, oh, I'm going to control the dragons, but the dragons are about the size of cats, you know? So he won't win the people's votes, so Victarion, the second best choice, is going to win instead. So Napoleon has to reconfigure his naval fleet with cannons, and that's going to take him a while. If you're wondering why he doesn't form a wall on the west coast, it's because that would take even longer than reconfiguring all of his ships, so he decides to do that instead. In the meantime, while he's trying to rig all these ships with cannons, the Iron Fleet makes things really tough for the coastal towns, but they are eventually suppressed. With every kingdom now under his control, Napoleon sits on the Iron Throne and is given a new and even longer title, if you can believe it. Napoleon I of House Bonaparte, Emperor of the French, King of Italy, Mediator of the Swiss Confederation, Protector of the Confederation of the Rhine, Co-Prince of Andorra, King of the Andals, the Rhoynar, and the First Men, Lord of the Seven Kingdoms, and Protector of the Realm. Napoleon then makes reforms to the Gold Cloaks and begins teaching the various kingdoms about modern warfare, with the exception of the Starks and the Tyrells, if the Tyrells sue for peace and are not exterminated. And the reason he's not teaching the Starks and the Tyrells about modern warfare is because he doesn't want them to be a threat to him in the future, because honestly, if any kingdoms are going to betray Napoleon, it would probably be the North of the Reach. Napoleon would also controversially consider the various fates of Westeros to be iffy, to say the least. Napoleon himself was notoriously cynical against religion and stated that he actually didn't believe in Jesus. So, needless to say, I don't think he would believe in any religions in Westeros either. But despite his opinion on the religions, he would wisely tolerate them. So now you're probably wondering about Daenerys Targaryen and her dragons. Well, for one thing, Napoleon won't actually have to deal with her for a long time, since she's still trying to conquer Slaver's Bay. However, he might take the fight directly to her and scatter her army before it becomes too big of a threat. Napoleon will know that dragons are a huge deal, and he'll probably try to take care of it before it becomes a problem. Even if Daenerys was at full strength by this point, though, Napoleon is just so well organized, and he has powerful weaponry, and I really think that he could bring down her dragons with his cannons. Another question you're probably asking is, what happens when Napoleon dies? Well, assuming that since Westeros has no real-world diseases, Napoleon would not actually die of cancer like he did in real life. Instead, he would live to be an old man, hopefully, and would probably conquer and annex most of Essos and the Stepstones. As for the others, Napoleon would treat them as a threat because he has a respect for Tywin and Tyrion Lannister, so when they warn him about the others, he's going to listen, and he's going to make sure that they're dealt with. And I do think he would actually be able to take care of them fairly easily. His dynasty now established, his son, Napoleon II, would ascend to be his successor. Also, if you're wondering about whom Napoleon II would be married off to, if not one of the Freys, then I believe he would marry Arianne Martell, assuming that she was still available, or possibly Marjorie Tyrell to ensure the Tyrells' cooperation, if they're still alive. And that is how I think things would have gone if Napoleon invaded Westeros.